All right, we're ready to start our week 4 painting, the ocean seascape. We'll go to File, New, and we will select 8 inches by 10 inches at 300 dpi. I have a canvas here. I want to load our week 4 reference image in your reference image palette. And we can go ahead and get started. So we'll create a layer for the sky. And we'll create another layer above that for the ocean horizon. And on that ocean horizon layer, we'll use the rectangular selection tool. And we will draw, let's fill up the bottom 2/3 of the canvas. So let's go like right here. So this is going to be mostly ocean. And let's use the paint bucket to go ahead and fill that. Now let's just kind of look at the color that we have here and try to gauge that. It's kind of a cyan, kind of blue-green color, something like this. Let's make it a little bit brighter, something like that. I like better. We'll do a Control D on our keyboard to deselect this selection. Let's go back to our sky layer and let's fill that with a color. Let's try this color and see. I think I like that. Now we'll go ahead and just detail our sky real quick to get that out of the way. So we'll use the digital airbrush for that. We want a big airbrush and we want to vary our color. We'll shift it down and to the left to make it a little bit darker, and we'll shift the hue towards indigo. And we'll paint in a nice gradient that's dark at the top and gets lighter as we move towards the horizon. Let's shift our hue more towards indigo and darken our color. And there we go. We've got a nice looking sky. Now let's lighten it a little bit towards the bottom as well. Let's use a light blue like this. And we'll make our brush a little bit smaller, about this size. And let's use a light, almost white cream color, just to paint right along the edge of the horizon there. And then we can blend up our sky a little bit using the diffuse blur blender. Let's use a little bit bigger of a brush. Remember to stay away from the edges of your canvas. We're just trying to blend up some of that color there to make it look a little bit nicer. Okay, now we'll go ahead and add a new layer above the ocean horizon for clouds. And let's use the same cream color that we have here. And we will use the jitter airbrush like we used in our week 1 painting. We'll set the composite method to screen. Let's just put in some basic clouds. We don't want to spend a whole lot of time on clouds in this painting. I just want to put in a few. Our perspective point's going to be pretty central. So if you want your clouds to kind of go into perspective, you can do that. I'm going to put just a few clouds here and there. When they get towards the horizon, they need to be a little bit thinner and more squashed. Let's just do a little bit of one up here. That will work for the clouds in my piece. You can put your clouds wherever you want. You'll notice I'm not trying to follow this exactly here. And let's blend our clouds a little bit using the coarse oily blender. Now you'll want to play with these settings a little bit. I've been using this brush kind of throughout the video. So what's important to take from this is not that you have to always use these exact settings that I have. You want to be aware which settings you should change to get different effects, and that's what's important. And for this particular brush, the coarse oily blender, what's important is that either you're going to get this texture or you're going to get something that just pulls really long streaks, and that's going to depend on what your grain is set to, your opacity, and your paper texture. Your paper texture is going to define the shape of the grain. And if your paper contrast and your paper scale are up really high, you're going to get a lot of grain. If you reduce them towards the other end, you're going to get something that's more streaky. And the amount of this streaking is going to change depending on your opacity. If we crank the opacity up, we get some different settings. If we crank the grain up, we get some different settings. The grain pulls out more. If we set the grain lower, just somewhere around 10, it doesn't pull it out as much. So it'll be up to you to kind of play around with these settings to figure out what works best for you. I find something like this that just kind of disturbs the top edge of the clouds works really well. And I'll go ahead and just really quickly add a little bit of detail to these. You can spend as much time as you want on your clouds. It's going to do mine nice and quick. And let's blend them a little bit with the diffuse blur brush here. And I have these settings up here. I want to use pretty light pressure with a big brush. And just lightly use kind of circular, small little circles to blend these just a little bit without destroying them. And there we go. We've got some basic clouds. I'm not really going to worry about adding any shadows or details to these. I might even just knock them back into the background just a little bit using the opacity slider so they don't stick out as much. Let's go ahead and just move the clouds below the ocean horizon layer. And let's move on to our ocean now. So let's go to our ocean horizon layer and turn on preserve transparency. And then let's vary our ocean color a little bit. So let's take the digital airbrush, make it pretty big compared to the ocean. And let's sample our base color that we have here for our ocean. And let's make it darker. And let's shift the hue towards indigo. Let's make a gradient that's darker on the bottom and gets lighter towards the horizon. And our beach is going to cover up some of this bottom area, so we want to bring our dark color up pretty far here towards the horizon. And when we have something like that, we're looking good. Let's sample our sky color, one of these lighter blues, and let's add some of that to the top edge of the horizon. Something like that. Now let's add some shading to our water here. Let's turn off preserve transparency. Let's right click on the ocean horizon layer and do select layer content. That puts a selection around our water. We'll create a new layer and let's call it Ocean Highlights. And we'll set the composite method to screen. We'll do a Control-Shift-H to hide the selection. And then we will choose the loaded palette knife. And let's sample the sky color here. Let's try that and see. You want your opacity to be pretty low with this brush. And you should be getting something that works kind of like this. When you use pretty light pressure, we want to add contrast. The detail is going to be closer to us, so the contrast is going to be a little more noticeable. So we still want to have smaller wave shapes in the background and larger ones in the foreground. And we want to maintain our perspective, which in this piece is going to kind of slightly go up and to the right. So in the background, we'll just do some pretty flat little wave shapes, kind of doing something like this, if I exaggerate. Just kind of sawing back and forth all along the horizon there. And then when we start going into the foreground here, I'm going to space these apart and make them a little more broad. I even make my brush bigger. And I'll make my palettes go away there so they don't interfere. And maybe just so we have a good idea of how far up our beach is going to go, let's just go ahead and just put some little indications of where we're going to end there. We won't go anywhere below that point. Now we could just fill in the rest of this here. So you can see this is all kind of in perspective now. If you want to, you can take one of these lighter sky colors And near the horizon, you can add in a few even brighter spots off in the distance. As long as you have this selection active, you don't have to worry about painting off of your horizon here. So now we'll go ahead and add some shadows the same way. We'll create a new layer, we'll call it Ocean Shadows, and we'll make it the opposite of a screen composite method, which is multiply. And let's sample one of our blue colors here from our water, and we'll use that with the same loaded palette knife, and we'll do the same technique that we were doing before. Now we want to try to keep these shadows on the underside of these lighter areas so that it looks kind of like a wave. And if I exaggerate it on this wave here, that's way off to the right, you can see kind of makes this nice wave indication. Now you don't have to do it exactly like that. You can be pretty quick about it, but wherever there's waves kind of around them, just kind of try to put in some contrast. Some dark area up against the light area will make it look like little waves. You can have some dark areas that are on their own, that's okay, and you can have some light areas that are on their own. But for the most part, you want to have them kind of hanging out together. Make my brush a little bit bigger at this point. And the more of this character you add, the more busy your water is going to look, the more it's going to look like it's moving. So that's kind of up to you to decide how much you're going to do there. We'll just kind of zoom in a little bit here on our water so we can get a feel for how we want that to look. And I think overall we're going to need to add in just a little bit more dark. In the foreground there. Now let's vary our colors just a little bit. Let's go to the ocean highlight layer, turn on preserve transparency, and let's sample this light sky color near the horizon. Use the digital airbrush with a pretty big airbrush. Let's just kind of use it to kind of lighten some of these highlights, kind of central here. So some of our highlights are kind of sky blue, and then they get lighter kind of here in the center. We can do that same thing with the ocean shadows. If we use a light color on a multiply layer, that'll kind of conceal it, so try not to use too much. But around here in the center, just kind of lighten some of those shadows a little bit near the horizon also. It gives it a little bit more depth. And then now we can go ahead and blend this all together. So let's go ahead and save our artwork. We'll go to File, Save. We'll save it as Aaron Rutten Week 4-1. This will be the first. And we get this error message here. That's okay. We'll just click OK. We get that every time we have a selection active. And then we're saving because we're going to be merging some layers. So we'll do a Save As. Save a copy. So we'll do -2. Now we can safely merge our layers. Let's turn off Preserve Transparency. Select the Ocean Shadows layer, hold Shift, and select the Ocean Horizon layer. And we'll merge them together by doing Control-E on the keyboard to merge those layers or collapse them. And let's just rename this Ocean, so that we know what it is. Let's turn on Preserve Transparency and let's blend it a little bit. So we can use a lot of different blenders here. Let's start with the coarse oily blender and let's see what we get based on these settings. I think that's okay. Just what you want is something to just break up these lines a little bit so that it doesn't look so digital. And what I mean by that is if you were to look really close at this, as it is now, these lines are kind of too perfect, and we want to add some imperfection to them and make them look a little more natural, a little more chaotic. I want to add some imperfection. It kind of adds more ripples and more waves. You'll have to, again, play around with these different grain and opacity and paper texture settings and the paper texture you choose. So you're going to get different results here. And I'll You can follow what I have here, or you can try out your own settings, but it's a good thing to experiment with because you'll be able to use it later for other paintings to get the kind of results that you want. I'm going to try to not really destroy too much of my detail here by blending over it. I don't want to ripple the water too much, but I do want to give it some nice character here. That's really helping it start to come together. We'll just go right up to about here where our water is going to end. And try to stay away from the edges. See, if I hit the edge here, you end up pulling in some of this white. And you can try to push it back out the other way to get it to go away. Same thing with your horizon. You can accidentally pull in some white, so don't try not to pull down vertically, just try to go horizontally, straight across. Try to get rid of any of these lines that are too sharp. Okay, something like that will work. Zoom out and see how we're looking. We'll use the diffuse blur brush to blend out anything else that's too sharp. Blend along the background a little bit. There we go. Now our water has some character to it. Now, another way to add some cool ripples and things is to play around with these distortion brushes. There's the bulge and the pinch brush. Let's use the pinch first and let's see what that does. Kind of pinches the water together. So you can use it to make kind of creases and folds and things. You'll have to play around with it. You don't really want to overdo it like that. You just want to, in a few spots here and there, just kind of pinch it a little bit. Give some form to the water. You can use the bulge brush. That does the opposite. It kind of inflates the area that you're painting over. Makes it bulge out. Use that a little bit. You can see it kind of makes the water ripple a little bit. You don't want to use it too much near the horizon. You want to use it more on the foreground. There we go. Now our water's rippling and moving around a lot. Looks more realistic. Again, I see some little areas here on the edge that got kind of messed up. So if that happens, you can use this Distorto brush to just kind of push that little white area back out of the canvas. And I'll do that over here too to clean up the sides a little bit. You could even use it to adjust your whole perspective point here. So we got something like that I think looks pretty good for the water. Now let's add a little bit more detail to the water. The water needs to have some reflection from the sky. So we'll add a new layer for that. Let's turn off Preserve Transparency. Let's right-click on the ocean layer and do Select Layer Content. Hide the selection with Control-Shift-H. And let's create a new layer. Let's call this Reflection. So this will be some of the sky color reflecting. What we want to do is we want to select the digital airbrush, select the sky color by sampling it, and we want to paint in some of this sky color. Just kind of brush over the water area like this, just to add kind of a tint. We're going to mask out some of it here using a mask, so you won't see the whole thing. We'll create a mask by clicking the new mask icon there. Make sure that we have black selected here. And for our brush, let's use this Pebbles brush. We'll use this a little bit later on the beach, but what it's going to do is it's going to make these nice elliptical shapes. If you press really hard with it, you're going to get wider, broader pebbles or holes in your paint. What we want to do is we want to poke some holes in this so that we get this kind of negative space rippling effect. So in the background, use a smaller brush and use kind of light pressure to do some kind of smaller shapes. Like so. And when you get into the foreground, start to press down harder with your pen to increase the size. And you can make your brush bigger, of course, as you near the foreground. Now we're going to try to get rid of most of this if we can, so you can continue to kind of go over it multiple times if you need to kind of try to erase most of it. Doesn't need to be as noticeable in the background. See how if I just keep going over it now in the foreground, I get this really nice rippled ocean effect. And if I turn down the opacity of this layer a little bit, I can blend it in and make it a little more subtle. We get something like this. We're looking pretty good. If you find that you want to bring some of that back, you can use white and you can paint in some more, bring it back. Again, this is another one of those additive and subtractive things where if you keep adding and you keep subtracting, you're going to get some more natural effects here. So we got something like that now for our reflection. Let's add another layer for some tinting. Let's call this tint, because we're going to want our water to be tinted a little bit so it's not such a static color. Let's select kind of blue-green, kind of teal color, maybe something like this. We'll choose the digital airbrush, and let's try painting in some of that blue-green here. We want it to fade from this base color we have, and when we start getting near the shoreline here, where we decided to end our water and our beach begins, that's where we want to start to fade into this green. This is kind of where the water is becoming more translucent. So I'm doing kind of a gradient that kind of fades. Something like this. We'll use maybe a lighter seafoam green. Something like this in here. We go a little bit lighter. There we go, something like that I think looks pretty good. And of course we can play with the opacity to kind of back it down a little bit. And let's add just a little bit more of this kind of teal aquamarine color to our water. Something like that. Just kind of want to smooth out the transition a little bit. There we go, something like that. It gives your water some flavor. Now we can go ahead and add a shoreline. We'll continue using this digital airbrush and we'll create a new layer for the shore. And we want to pick a nice sand color. Let's take a look at what we have in our example here. You want kind of just a light tan brown color. Using the digital airbrush with a pretty big brush, we're going to do a gradient that's very opaque in the foreground and kind of fades into the water, like in our example here. So I'll go ahead and start painting. Just fill it in here. This is going as slowly for you as it is for me. Use a smaller brush to fill in most of this foreground stuff. It's nice if it has a little bit of character to it, so it's okay if it's a little lumpy. When we start to get here, we're going to want to fade it. See how it kind of starts to fade together? Get a nice effect like that. We're looking pretty good. Now let's darken this color a little bit. Let's shift it towards red a little bit more. And let's darken this area here. So the sand's going to be a little bit more wet. Right there, it's going to be darker. Where the water hits it. Let's add a little bit more of this rose color to this. We got kind of a rose gray. Let's add in some of that. I'll make it look like a really nice wet area there. And now we've got a nice blend for our sand. Now, if you want to add some contrast to your sand, that's always a good thing. You can sample your sand color here, and you can add some lighter areas and some darker areas. So we could do kind of a light kind of strip here. You know, sometimes the tide comes in and makes these ripples. We could sample our darker sand color here, darken it a little more. We could add some contrast in between those light ripples. Add some dark ripples. That just gives your sand a little bit of contour and character. Now we're ready to add some texture. Let's create a new layer. Let's call it Shore Texture. And we'll set the composite method to multiply. We'll want to make sure that when we add this texture that we paint in perspective, so our texture in the foreground needs to be broader than our texture going towards the background. We use the sponge. Let's take a dark brown color like this. And we'll use a pretty big sponge. I'm going to paint in horizontally across a little bit of texture, and then I'm going to reduce my brush size, paint a little bit more, reduce it again, and so on until we go up into the background. Put a little bit of texture up into the water. You want to be able to see that. And if you want to, you can add a little bit more texture with a bigger brush. There we go. We got something like that. That looks pretty good for our general texture. And then we can go ahead and blend that using the diffuse blur. Now the background stuff we want to blend pretty lightly horizontally straight across. So very light pressure, horizontally straight across. Get into the foreground. You can start to follow these contours of your land if you want to vary it a little bit. I'm kind of going sloping down and then up, following these curves. If your texture ever so subtly follows that contour, it's going to fit in better. Very, very light pressure. If you use too firm pressure, you're going to totally destroy your texture here. You don't want to do that. Now we can reduce the opacity to get a more subtle blend of texture. Maybe something like that works a little bit better, and now it starts to look like it's actually sand. Now the next thing that we'll do is we'll add a little bit more texture that looks like individual grains of sand. We'll create a new layer, and we'll select our sample, our sand color here. Let's lighten it a little bit and shift it towards yellow. The brush that we'll use for this is the Pixel Spray brush. We'll select that, and you want these settings that I have here. Hopefully what you'll get with this brush is something like this, and I'll zoom in, and I'll use a different color really quick so that you can really see this. So I'm getting this fine spray of little pixels. That's going to look like sand when we spray it down. But we'll want to use a sand color like this. You'll want to make sure that if your pen has a tilt feature, that you keep your pen upright. And so what I mean by that is with your cursor here, you can see your pen tilting, so you want to make sure it's just centered, pointing upright on your tablet. And so we'll paint in some sand. This will be kind of hard to see. It'll be very, very subtle. You want to, again, go kind of up into your water here. And just kind of keep going back and forth, spraying the sand on. You can switch to a very light, almost white color, and then with a smaller brush near the shoreline, spraying a little bit of white, because there might be some wet sand up there. And you can take a darker color and put in some sand that's a little bit darker in the foreground. And now if we zoom into this, you can see we have something that looks like really, really nice sand. Now we'll have to blend it a little bit. We want to, of course, take the sand out of the water so it doesn't look like it's dust. So we will use the diffuse blur brush for that. And you can go ahead and use firm pressure on this sand in the water to get rid of it. So I'm just painting across with firm pressure. And then when we start to get into this area where the water is, we'll want to use lighter pressure and just go straight across with light pressure. And then when we get into the foreground, we'll start to follow these contours. You want to try to get all the sand if you can, because if you don't, even though this looks really great from far away, if you look at this up close and you print it big, you're going to see those little pixels and it won't look so great. If you want to, you can take the opacity down a little bit to get a nice blend. I want this to be subtle. So when you zoom in here, you don't see a bunch of little pixels, you see a bunch of little grains of sand. There's a million, billion, trillion grains of sand here, and I painted it pretty quickly. So it's a really nice effect that you get there. Now we need some slightly bigger sand, so let's just make another layer called Sand 2. This will be some larger chunks of rocks here. Let's use the pepper spray brush for this, and you want your feature to be pretty low. Let's start out at 2 and see what we get. If you increase this feature size, you're going to increase the size of the rocks that you get. We want it to be pretty small. I'm going to increase my brush size. I'm going to pick a color that we can see real quick just to show you how this works. It's going to spray out little specks. We'll go a little bit bigger. Let's go to 3. There we go. See how we get some bigger grains of sand? We'll change our composite method to multiply, and let's pick a kind of medium tan color, and let's just, with kind of light pressure, scatter a few little grains here and there. I'll zoom into this so you can see where these are landing. So they're kind of just spreading out here and there. They're not really closely clumped together, so they're kind of sprinkled on there. And we can change the color to some different colors. Just sprinkle them in. Again, you want to try to keep your pen upright, because if you go to the side, you're going to get a weird airbrush effect like this if you have pen tilt. It starts to spray it out at an angle, and you don't want that. So use light pressure and keep your pen upright. And we got some stuff like that. We're looking pretty good. Let's blend that with the diffuse blur blender. We'll use firm pressure to get rid of the little sand that's in the water there, and then when we get towards the shoreline, we'll use light pressure to kind of blend it horizontally, following these curves and contours that we've established in our sand. There we go. And if you really wanted to make the sand sparkle, you could go back to the sand layer, select an almost white yellow color, and we'll use the same pepper spray brush. And you could just put in a couple little spots here where the sand is really wet. And of course, we want to blend that again using the diffuse blur blender. Light pressure in a couple spots. Now we've got a little bit of glimmer on our sand there. We've got a pretty fine looking beach, if I do say so myself. We can continue adding to it. Now let's create some waves and a water line. So let's create a new layer, and let's call it waves. We'll set the composite method to screen. We'll select the loaded palette knife brush with an almost white, kind of light blue color like this. And we'll paint in some indications of our water line and our waves. So let's do our water line first, where our color kind of starts to fade from this green into the brown. We can make this our water line here. Maybe it kind of goes like this. So that's going to be generally where our water begins to reach the shore. You can vary it a little bit. I'm kind of varying my pressure to try to get these different kind of ripple effects. Something like that. Looks pretty good. And then our wave that's going to be kind of crashing over, like we see in our reference image here, kind of indicate where that's going to be. Just very lightly, maybe it'll kind of go up along here. Now let's put in some thicker areas where this wave is going to begin to crash. Let's say here it's going to start to break here, and then this will be another area of a lot of movement. We'll do one over here. Kind of goes off out of the composition. I'll just zoom in just a bit so we can see this a bit better. Now let's add some reflections to the back side of these waves. So we will use a little bit of the sky color here, and we'll use kind of light pressure just to add a little bit of light color to the back side of these waves. Something like this. And then kind of running off of that, you could have some little light blue areas that kind of trail off. It's going to really help it look like the wave is kind of curling up here. You could do some kind of in front of it too to make it look like there's a little bit more motion going on here in the water. And you can help establish these contours also by kind of doing some curved strokes. Let's go ahead and add some shadows to these waves. Let's create a new layer below the waves layer. And let's call this Waves Shadow. And this will be a multiply composite method. Let's sample our watercolor here. Let's use the loaded palette knife, and we'll put in some shadow right underneath these major waves. And you want to try to follow the contour of the wave. So I'm going to just go right underneath, and then I'm going to use some kind of curved strokes to make these waves look like they're kind of curling. If I exaggerate, I'm doing something like this. And behind the waves, if there's anywhere that you wanted to add a little bit more contour, you could do that. And then of course we want to play with the opacity a little bit to blend this in a little bit more, like so. And then we could use the diffuse blur or the coarse oil blender to blend. I'm going to use the diffuse blur to take some of the sharpness out of the stuff I put in the back, and to blend following the direction of these contours for these shadows. Now these waves really look like they're kind of popping up and out. You could do this with the shoreline a little bit too, and add a kind of a darker, a little bit of an area underneath this water line here. Kind of separate it and make it look more elevated, like there's a layer of water. Now let's add a little bit of foam to make the waves look like they're breaking. We'll add a new layer as the topmost layer and call it foam. And we want to sample our sky color. And we want to dull it down a little bit, so let's take kind of a blue-gray like this. And we'll use the square chalk brush for this. And depending on what you have your paper set to here, you're going to get some different results. So let's try the Italian watercolor with the contrast scale turned up, and let's see what we get. If you're getting something kind of like this, where you get this nice broken foam pattern, then you're going to be looking good. So I'm going to make my brush a bit smaller, and we'll add in some foam here. You don't want to do a whole lot because these are kind of smaller waves. Just going to hit tab, make my palettes go away here. And you also kind of want to have some bearing. You want your waves to kind of be going a certain direction when they're breaking here. And kind of cover up this sharp edge with a foamy edge here. Don't cover up all of your shadow area. So we get something like that. And then let's add some highlights to our foam. So we want it to look nice and three-dimensional. So we'll turn on Preserve Transparency. We'll lighten our color here. Just something like this light blue. And let's add some texture to our foam. So let's do it kind of on the top side here. I want to leave some areas that have shadow and some that don't. Now we want to add movement to these, so let's blend them. We'll turn off Preserve Transparency. And let's take the coarse oily blender and let's see what kind of results we get with this paper texture here. If you're getting something where the water's kind of slightly breaking like this, then we're looking good. So I'm going to go back a couple steps and we want to establish the direction that our wave's going. So that one's breaking that way, and this one's maybe going up a little bit there and over that way. I'm going to kind of go in different directions here. This gives the waves a movement. I'm really just kind of using my imagination here. I get something like that. Looks a lot like a wave. Now, the other part of the wave is kind of the little globs of water that splash off of it. And so we will want to add those as well. Let's add those on a separate layer. Let's call that spray. And this will be a screen composite method. We can use the same light blue color that we have here. And for this, let's return to our pepper spray brush. And as you recall, we get this spray effect. We want to increase our feature to something maybe like 6, somewhere in that range. And again, you want to try to keep your pen upright, because if you don't, you're going to get this weird airbrush thing. You won't like that. So level upright pen. And what we want to do is we want to spray these little particles going with the direction that our wave is crashing. So this wave is crashing down and to the left. So my particles that I spray, I'm going to use very light pressure here and kind of tap. They're going to kind of go this direction. These are kind of going up. These are kind of going over. I'm going to be blending these, so don't worry about getting them perfect. Now something like that. We're looking good. We'll blend it a little bit with the diffuse blur brush, and we want to blend in the direction that our wave is going again. So this is going to give us some motion, like so. Now our waves really look like they're moving. The water's kind of captured in time, like it would be with a photograph. You really get the impression of what's going on here with these waves. Now, the next thing that we can do is we can tint some of this a little bit. So let's do the foam layer first. Let's select the foam and turn on Preserve Transparency. And then let's select the digital airbrush. And let's sample our watercolor here. And here and there in a couple spots, especially towards the bottom, let's just tint some of our foam color here to give it a little bit of a tint from the water. And we could even tint it with the sky color a little bit too. It kind of just gives it some flavor here and there. We can go to our spray layer and we can do the same. We can tint our spray slightly blue in a couple spots. Slightly green in a couple spots if you want to. It just makes it look more natural because a lot of this stuff isn't going to be pure white. It's going to be picking up all these colors around it. Now we want to kind of finish up our water a little bit. You can keep adding to it if you want to add another little layer of details. Let's call it water details. You can really go nuts with this, and you can use a almost light blue, and you can use the loaded palette knife. And you can go in here and you can draw in all kinds of little ripples and things that follow the contour of your waves. You probably want to move the layer underneath the foam and the spray. And this could be foam, this could be little bubbles, it could be all kinds of different things. And you could spend as much time as you want doing this. I'm trying to keep these videos pretty short and pretty concise, so I don't want to spend too much time drawing these little details, but while you're at home and you're working on this, you can do as many little details as you want to really make your painting stand out and look exceptional. And of course, we can turn down the opacity of that layer to kind of blend it in and make it more subtle. We can even blend it a little bit using the diffuse blur. Make it not stand out so much. Very light pressure going horizontally, more or less. So that really brings things together now and makes it look like nice rippling water. So now that we've established our waves and we've got most of our water done, let's go ahead and just enhance this wave and make it look a little bit more transparent. So let's go to our tint layer and let's select kind of a lime green like this, and let's see what we get. Let's use the digital airbrush. Let's try painting. What we want to do is we want to go kind of right underneath where these waves are, add a little bit of a light area like that, and that'll kind of make the water look a little more transparent. You could also use a kind of a seafoam green like this, but I thought in this case this looked kind of nice. We'll add a little seafoam over it. Something like that looks really good. And so you can continue adding details, do whatever you want to the water, but I think at this point we'll just go ahead and move forward and we'll add some more details like pebbles and debris on the shoreline, and then eventually we'll add some cliffs to the background. Let's add some bigger rocks and stones and pebbles, so we'll create a new layer. And let's call it Pebbles. And first we'll lay down some of the smaller ones. So we'll use the pepper spray brush again. And we'll see how our feature of 6.5 works here. I think that would be okay. So we'll make a pretty big brush. We'll select a color for our pebbles. Maybe we'll do kind of a dark gray first. And we'll just tap, very light taps here and there. These will be some bigger rocks. I want to have some almost white, light blue things. These could be little bits of shells and things. You can really do just about any color. Just put down a few different colors here and there. Try to keep them as natural colors, browns and grays and reds. You could do some that are kind of based off of your sky color a little bit too, some blue grays like that. All that stuff will look like little stones, and then we can increase the feature size to maybe something like 10. And each time you increase your feature size, you'll want to use fewer and fewer rocks. So you want to have a lot of little rocks and fewer big rocks. So we'll go ahead and stick with that there. And let's create another layer. We'll call it Pebbles 2. These will be a little bit bigger, and for this we will use the Pebbles brush right here. We used this a little bit before on the water, so we kind of know how it works. It's going to make these little flat pebbles. And what we will want to do in this case is we're going to want to get some rocks and things that are kind of in perspective. So the easiest way to do that is to transform it a little bit. So we'll go ahead and just lay down these pebbles. We want to have smaller pebbles in the background and larger pebbles in the foreground. And don't worry about these looking kind of weird because we're going to mask some of these off, and this will be kind of more like a texture. Something like that. And we have a nice sense of perspective going on here. Take down the opacity so it looks a little more subtle. Like that. Maybe we'll go a little bit higher. Something like that. And then let's take down the opacity of our other pebbles layer. I think that looks pretty good. And then let's go ahead and at this point, let's save because we're going to be merging some layers. So I'm going to save, doing a Control S on my keyboard. And I'm going to do a file save as, save a copy here. And then let's select the Pebbles 2 layer and the other Pebbles layer by holding Shift. And we'll do a Control E to collapse the layers or merge them together. We'll just call it Pebbles. And what we'll do here is we'll do a nice little trick where we'll transform this. So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit so that we can see the edges around our canvas here. And I'm going to go to Edit, Free Transform with the Pebbles layer selected. And then I'm going to go to Perspective Distortion. Now, if you don't get it right the first time and it starts to move like that, we'll have to try it again. We'll click the cancel button if you don't get it right, and we'll try it again. And so we drag from the corner here and we get this kind of trapezoid effect. And that really puts things into perspective now. Our texture that we put down and all our little pebbles and things, it's a very subtle flow into perspective here. It makes everything really work. We'll go to the check mark here to commit to this change. And then we'll use our layer adjuster to move this texture straight down a little bit so that it covers everything. And if we need to mask it off anywhere, we can go ahead and add a mask. Click inside the mask to enable it. Select black. And we could use maybe the digital airbrush just to kind of paint anywhere that we want to make sure that we clean up, especially in the water here. We don't want to have any weird floating rocks. Something like that looks good. Now we have the indication of a bunch of stones and things. Now, if we want to draw in some individual stones, we can create a new layer for that. We call it Stones. And then we'll use the loaded palette knife first to draw in some stones. Let's select a dark brown gray color like this. And the reason why we're using this brush is because it makes kind of flat shapes pretty easily. And as I mentioned before, that's a good thing. You want to kind of go with the flow of the perspective here. So see how my rocks that are kind of off to the side, they're kind of making sure they kind of flow at an angle here. They don't all have to go the same direction because, you know, rocks are going to go different ways here. But what's important is that most of them kind of have this general bearing. We want to make sure that the rocks in the background are smaller than the rocks in the foreground. They don't all have to be the same color either. I'm just going to kind of do them all one color like this, and then I'll change the color afterward to something that's a little bit more appropriate. So there we go. We'll turn on Preserve Transparency, and we can color these rocks whatever color we want. Let's add some shadows to them first. We'll select one of these dark sky colors, and we'll darken it just a little bit. Let's see if that works for a shadow color. I think it does. So we want to put some shadows on our underside of our rocks. If our light's kind of central, then we'll have our shadows on one side, and then on the opposite side, we want them to be on a different side here. Our rocks look like they're kind of inset into the ground a little bit there. And then let's vary the color of some of them. Let's make this one back here kind of white. Maybe this one will be kind of whitish also. And we'll make maybe a light blue gray one. Do a darker one over here. Put a little highlight on it to make it stand out. And we'll do some different colors. That's a good, quick, and easy way to get some rocks, and we can put some texture over them using the sponge. A nice dark color. Just tap in a couple places to add some nice texture to your rocks. I see one here that I want to add a little bit of highlight to, and if you add a little bit of highlight to some of these, that helps make them stand out a little bit too and make them look a little bit more wet. Now you can continue adding debris like driftwood and seaweed and all kinds of stuff on new layers. So I'll just try that real quick. Let's call it debris. And for the driftwood, you probably want to sample your sky color and then pick kind of a gray. Shift it a little bit towards yellow, and you could put in some driftwood using the loaded palette knife. I'll just put in a couple of weird little pieces here of wood. And maybe we'll do some seaweed, so we'll pick kind of a dark seaweed color and using the same brush. Throw in some seaweed here. And we can turn on preserve transparency and add highlights wherever we want. Add some highlights to our driftwood here. We'll add some warm highlights to it to make it kind of stand out a little bit better. And if we want to add some shadows, we pick kind of darker colors, go along the bottom edge. Really make it look like it's sitting there on the beach. Do that a little bit with our seaweed also. There you go, you've got some debris. We could add little specks of white and things that could be little seashells. So you can just kind of go on an adventure here and add all kinds of stuff to your beach. But I'll just kind of go ahead and move forward here, because I can't spend all day on this, even though I want to. When we're through adding objects to our beach here, the last thing that we'll do to our beach before we move on is we'll add a little bit more contour to it. So let's go to the shore layer and let's sample our sand color, one of our lighter sand colors here. And let's shift it a little bit lighter. And if we add lighter colors, we're going to elevate the sand. If we add darker colors, we're going to push the sand down. So what we want to do is we want to, in a few spots, kind of raise the sand up. You can kind of do it around these rocks here to make the rocks look like they're kind of sunken in. You could also make some indications of little ripples and ridges and things if you want to make it look like the water's been kind of lapping against the shore there. And we can use a darker color. Let's sample one of these darker colors from our sand here, and let's add some darker areas so the sand looks more sunken in. This will be really kind of subtle. If you have trouble seeing it, it's because there's some other layers on top of it. And if you need to, you can always add another layer if you want above these sand layers. Let's call it contour. Let's make it a multiply composite method. Now if we paint on that, we'll be able to see these a little bit better. Enhance these pieces of driftwood with some shadows, and the rocks and all this debris. Enhance these ripples here. See the kind of nice effects that you get when you add contour. Now, if you go too heavy with it, you can always play with the opacity to back it down a little bit. I think that looks pretty nice. We can go ahead and move forward with the next step, which will be adding some distant cliffs. Well, let's add some distant cliffs like we have in our example here. We'll create a new layer. We'll call it Cliffs Far. Let's pick a kind of dark indigo color. We'll try something like this. And let's use the mountain knife for our cliffs. We'll try painting with it, and we get something kind of similar to what we got when we were working on the mountain. So we'll go ahead and paint in our cliff shapes. You want them to be nice and jagged. Fill them in pretty good. Down near the edge, you want it to be kind of flat. And we can kind of clean up the edge a little bit too if you want, using the eraser, so don't stress on it too much. We'll kind of fill in something like this. Just make sure it's filled in pretty well. Just giving it some character here. And we can go ahead and use the eraser to clean up the bottom a little bit. So I'm going to have it go just below the horizon line, and then a couple spots it'll stick out. You get kind of flat there on the bottom. And have a nice cliff shape. We'll turn on Preserve Transparency, and we'll go back to our mountain knife, and we'll pick kind of red hue. We'll lighten our colors slightly, and we'll put in some highlights kind of on one side. We want these cliffs to look like they match the light source. So if our light source is kind of central, then we want to have highlights on one side and then shadows on the other. So do something kind of like that. And let's switch to the square chalk brush, and we'll want to use the organismal texture paper called Polypay Wool. Let's set our paper scale and our paper contrast about midway, and let's sample our dark color here, and let's paint over it. Paint over our highlights with some of this dark color. We'll sample our brown color, and we'll paint to bring some of that back in. See, I'm getting these nice cliffs. We can vary paint color and our paper texture to get some other results here. We'll make these a bit smaller. There we go. Getting these random results really helps, because then it makes your cliffs not so intentional. And we can kind of clean this up a little bit by using the sponge. Sample this darkest color and go over it with the sponge a little bit. In some places, that'll really help give it a little more texture. I think something like that looks pretty good. If you want to set part of your cliffs into the distance, we can switch to the digital airbrush, sample our sky color, and use a pretty big airbrush to tint some of the stuff that's in the distance and higher up. And if you want to tint it a little bit darker in the foreground, you could do that too. That kind of helps a little bit. Now our cliffs look like they're a little bit more there in the environment. Let's add a little bit more character to these cliffs using the square chalk. We'll vary the color just a little bit in a couple spots. Give a little more character there. You know, these nice little natural patches of color and things. Now, we'll want to add a water line in front of our cliffs. We can go ahead and conserve layers here at this point. So let's move the Cliffs Far layer down. Let's go ahead and just move it down below water details, and we'll put this stuff on the water details layer. That is the layer that has all these little ripples and things. So we don't need to use a million layers here. We'll try to save some. We'll turn off Preserve Transparency, And we'll select kind of light blue off-white color, something like that. And we'll use the loaded palette knife. And we'll put in a water line that kind of divides the bottom edge of the cliffs from the surface of the water. We want it to be pretty flat and not too thick. Something like that really helps with the cliffs. If you wanted to, you could kind of make it look like the water's kind of splashing up against the cliff. Let's take a brighter, almost white. A couple spots, add a little bit of white. There we go. And then we need to reflect some of this darkness into the water for the cliffs to look appropriate. So let's go to the tint layer, because we know that's a layer that we can use. It has something similar on it. And let's use the digital airbrush. We'll sample this dark color for our cliffs, and we want our reflection to match. So you want everything to be the right height for your reflection. So my reflection kind of, I'm trying to trace what I have here right down the center so that everything lines up. Doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to kind of give the impression that there's some shadow there underneath. So I'm going to make sure it's real nice and dark. Put in a little bit of the light brown. So some of that's in there too. And we'll zoom back out and see what we have. We'll end up blending that reflection a little bit later when we're ready to do that. So for now, we can just leave it as it is. And let's go ahead and add some cliffs to the foreground. So we'll create a new layer as the topmost layer. We'll call it Cliffs Foreground. We'll sample our darkest color from our background cliffs, and we'll make sure that the color that we use for the foreground cliffs is a little bit darker. So we'll shift it in value down just a little bit, and maybe we'll move it towards indigo, towards purple just a little bit more. I'll use a medium-sized brush, and I'm going to go ahead and move our reference image over so that we can see kind of what we're going for here. I'm going to put in some weird cliff shapes. Maybe they'll come above the horizon line like that, just a little bit. Maybe they only go to right about here. So I don't want them to interfere with that wave that I have there, because that wave is kind of already doing its own thing. And then of course we can use a smaller brush if we need to clean it up, and use the eraser to erase the bottom of it. Having these nice angles really helps the rock to look like it's layered. So I'm doing these kind of right angle things. And we can put some texture on it the same way that we did with the background cliffs. We can turn on Preserve Transparency, and we can use Mountain Knife to pick a color that we want to use for our cliffs. Now we have some nice stones here, and we'll vary our color a little bit. We want the bottom edge to look like it's got some kind of algae stuff going on here. And then let's use the square chalk and sample the dark color. We use the same paper texture we have here. Let's paint in some different cracks and things. We'll sample our lighter color, lighten it a little more, change our paper scale, add some highlights to these rocks. Maybe that was too much there. And then we'll add some reflections to the back side. So we'll sample our sky color and dull it down, make kind of a light blue-gray. Put in a little bit of the reflection from the sky. That always helps. There we go. We've got some kind of foreground rocks. Now we want to go ahead and just move these down above the cliff's far layer so that we can take advantage of this water details layer. Turn off preserve transparency. We'll take the loaded palette knife, again a kind of light blue off-white color, and with the loaded palette knife we will add a water line to separate these rocks from the water. And then of course we want to add some shadow or some reflections from the rocks, so let's go to this tint layer that we've been using. Take the digital airbrush, sample this dark color here from our rocks. We want to pull down some dark area here, and again you want to try to match the reflection as best you can. Something like that. We'll sample a lighter brown color and put some of that in. A little bit of that green. I have a nice looking reflection there. Maybe we'll just blend these foreground rocks just a little. So we'll go to Cliff's Foreground, turn on Preserve Transparency, zoom in a little bit, and we will use the Coarse Oily Blender, blend it just a little bit, give it a little bit of character. And we use the sponge with this darkest color sampled, a pretty big sponge. Put in some sponge texture. If we want to make the stone look a little wet, like water's been splashing on it, we can use the square chalk brush for that. And we can use a light blue kind of off-white. We can put a couple little specks of white here and there. It'll make the rock look like it has kind of water reflecting off of it. We can blend that reflection a little bit with the diffuse blur. Make the water look like it's kind of running off of the rock. It makes it look a little bit more natural. And in a couple spots here and there, you can maybe add little blue spots from the sky. That will help too. There we go. Okay, so now we can go ahead and wrap this piece up and add the finishing touches to everything. We'll go ahead and save. Go to File, Save. And let's do a File, Save As to save a copy. Now, one thing I noticed in this example I have here for our reference image, the water's a little bit deeper, and I think I ended up making it too light here. So this is a good point to show you that you're not really stuck working in this order. You can at any point go back to any of these layers and add to them and manipulate them if you want. So, for instance, this ocean layer, if this isn't deep enough, I could do something like duplicate it by right-clicking on it and selecting Duplicate Layer. And then I could select Multiply, and that will multiply that darkness of that layer, and then I can reduce the opacity to make the water look a little bit deeper and darker, which I think I want to do. It helps the piece quite a bit to improve the overall contrast of everything. So again, what I did is I just duplicated this ocean layer, which is this layer here. And then when I set it to the multiply composite method, it just kind of multiplied the dark with the dark and made it all darker, which is a nice way to kind of fix that problem after the fact. If you think it looked better lighter, you can keep it that way too. And there's no right or wrong there. We'll go ahead and flatten all of our layers at this point. So we will go to Layers, Drop All. And now we can add some finishing touches here. So we're going to want to blend in some different places. Let's use the Coarse Oily Blender first to blend a little bit of our reflection here of our rocks. So I'm going to go kind of horizontally. This will be pretty subtle, but I'm going to kind of break up this reflection a little bit. And then I'm going to go to this reflection on this rock, break it up a little bit. I'm trying to avoid going into my foam here or anything else. I think that's good for the rock. And then if I want to play with the foam a little bit. I can adjust that a little bit, kind of fix up some of the edges. Go back here, I don't like that. Okay. Fix that a little bit. And then if you want to blend here in your water anywhere, that can kind of help to kind of bring it together a little bit better. Just kind of scrubbing back and forth. Your water line is a good place to kind of blend, and on your foam. You want to blend your cliffs a little bit, you can. Blend these a little more. Just whatever you think you need to do to kind of bring it all together. Get it looking complete. Maybe we'll blend a couple of our rocks a little bit and our driftwood. Blend our seaweed a little bit. We can blend some of our little textures by going kind of horizontally here. A couple of these spots, don't overdo it though, because we want to try to keep most of the sand color and texture. We'll zoom out a little bit and see what we have. And I think that we have a completed painting at this point. So we'll do our standard things like a vignette and a signature. We'll do the vignette first. We'll take a dark indigo color, choose a multiply composite method and the digital airbrush. Use a pretty big digital airbrush to create a vignette around the edges of the composition. This works really well here in the foreground. And one last thing before I forget, we want to add a little bit of focal depth using the blur brush, and we want to be on the canvas layer here. And we especially want to blur the horizon line for the ocean. So I'm going to use a small brush and just paint along the horizon, trying to avoid any of the rocks or the cliffs. And I just want to make this horizon less sharp. It's very far away. Go over it just a little bit, and then any of the details in the ocean that are near that, I'll blur those a little bit as well. And then we can blur some of the edges of the cliffs to set those back into the distance a little bit. And we can blur the edges of this foreground rock just a little bit to kind of set it back as well. I think that helps quite a bit to bring the piece together. Now, it's looking like we have a finished piece, so we can go ahead and save it. And then we'll do a file save as to save a copy. Save it as 5. And we'll do a layers drop all. We'll create a new layer for our signature. And we'll use the scratchboard tool to sign it down at the bottom. And then we'll go ahead and save again to save this copy. And then we'll do a layers drop all again, and we'll save our versions for print and web. So we'll go to save as, save it as a TIFF, save it as week 4 print. And then we will do a canvas resize. Make sure constrained file size is not checked. Change the resolution first to 72. Change the measurement to inches. We want 8 by 10. Now we have a smaller size. We'll go to File Save As, and we'll call this a PNG file. We'll call it Web. Click Save. And now we have a smaller version for the web. So that is our week 4 assignment. And what I hope is that you'll be able to combine everything that you've learned from all 4 of these weeks to create paintings from your imagination. You might need to refer to a photo for inspiration to get an idea for what to paint and how to paint it. but this should give you an idea of just kind of how to do that a little more automatically now that you know why things are shaded a certain way, and how to choose colors and how to make different forms and shapes and landscape elements. So I hope you enjoyed working with this class. I'm going to be creating more classes in the future that will deal with sunset skies and night scenes and other kinds of landscape elements like waterfalls and deserts, and even some stuff beyond landscape painting. So I look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks for participating in my class.